Hello. Hey,
Hello.
Fred.
Sorry, I'm sitting on one side because my camera does not cope with even a small amount of sunlight bleeding in.
This is true. Hey, Bob, Raphael, haven't seen you guys for a while. Nice to see you today.
Hi, good to see you. I've been in the process of moving my office and living space, so I'm not available very often, and I may have to leave this a little early today again. But anyway, I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. Excellent, excellent. Just checking a few things. Just sent out a reminder email to people, thought might as well.
So this week has been difficult. I discovered the conference I'm going to at the end of the month has now decided to sort of, they'd like everything videoed and in advance, and with somewhat less time than normally had. So the usual routine of writing your presentation on the plane on the way to the conference has now rather gone out the window.
Yeah, I managed to do mine. I'm happy about that. But yeah. Hello.
Hi.
OSNR. I am guessing you're actually Omar.
Yep.
Fantastic. So nice to meet you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being in the book. Thank you for being here today. And let's see who joins us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was Fabienne, of course, who invited you. And I thought that was an ecstatically brilliant move on Fabienne's part. And when it was brought up in one of the group discussions, everybody was very enthusiastic. So that's very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, David. Haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you. Same here. Hey, Mark. Hey, Raphael.
And we have Brian here. I'm not sure if I know you, Brian, so welcome. Are you, oh yeah, you're muted. Are you there? I am guessing he's getting coffee or something. And Fabienne always looks so serious when he comes on Zoom. Have you noticed? It's always full concentration on another screen. And he's not even listening to me.
Mm-hmm.
And Brandel is coming on. Hi, Brandel. So Omar, the way we usually do these things, we wait a few more minutes. And then, I see a message from Brian here. That's good. And then whoever's here in the first few minutes, they do a 10-second intro. So you have a clue who's in the room. Then you present for as long or as little as you feel like. And then we just dive into discussions. Simple, really.
Sounds great.
Good morning.
Morning, Peter. Let's do a few basic intros. We're going to go by my screen. They're all different. So we'll start with you, Raphael. 10, 15 seconds, please.
Hi, I'm Raphael. I'm in Brazil. I like to organize things, and my project is based on organizing the mess that is the web.
That was quick and perfect. I'm actually next on the screen, so I'll introduce myself. Frode Hagelin, Future of Text, Augmented Text Software, and so happy that you guys are joining today. Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Dunningham from the sunny south coast of UK. My background really is in hypertext more than anything, and I guess, and I've been involved in future text for a while. And the thing that's involved me at the moment is the thought of really how the spatial hypertext crosses over with VR.
Fantastic. Bob Horn.
Bob Horn. I'm in San Francisco. I do lots of synthesis kinds of work, particularly on large information murals.
Omar, even though you're the speaker, tell you what, I'll give you 30 seconds to introduce yourself.
Okay, let me think. I didn't prepare an intro, but I'm Omar. I was in the Future of Text write-up. I've done a bunch of different things kind of in this general area of like new media, future text, hypertext, new computer interfaces, new programming. I worked at Dynamic Land, which was a research lab that was kind of doing a physical spatial computer. I've done a lot of other different experiments with like different ways to interact with computing.
Perfect. David.
Yeah, I'm the inventor and CEO of a company, Highlighter, that's developing a product that's trying to fill a gap between multi-source reading and sense making and writing.
Thank you. Fabian.
Hi, I'm Fabien. I'm a prototypist with all the gadgets around, but mostly focusing on VR and AR on the web to organize my mind.
Thank you. Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Finn. I'm I suppose some kind of software developer. My best known thing is something I did a while ago, which is called Sibelius, which is a music composing program. It's like a word processor for music. It's been going for some decades now. And in recent years, I've turned my attention to text, and I'm coming up with a very radical way of, you could say, word processing, but it encompasses lots of things. So it covers all kinds of areas that are covered by the future of text.
Look forward to talking about that. For me, you dropped out just as you said, Sibelius. I just thought I'd repeat that. That was the name of the software, Sibelius.
That's the name of the software. It's well known in the industry.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Carl.
Hi, I'm in Alexandria, Virginia. I've focused on supporting employees or in general people with disabilities. Big fan of Doug Engelbart, so that's how I found the group, or the group found me.
Excellent. Show Young.
Hi everyone, I'm Shuo. I'm based in New York, New Jersey. I'm currently a UX designer at Google. I'm also a big fan of the Dynamic Land and Engelbart's, and also love the highlighter. David, I'm a big fan of that. So thanks for inventing this.
Thank you. Brandel.
My name is Brendel. I'm in the Bay Area. I work as an AR VR creative technologist, focusing on the future of the web at Apple, where we'll look at how to use sort of all of the technologies that we're sort of trying to cram into things, and in particular playing with things like virtual reality, word processing, and text manipulation and stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, a big fan of embodied cognition and extended mind, and trying to figure out the sort of practical consequences of those kinds of philosophies, and what they would mean you should do with human-computer interaction.
Thank you. Peter.
Well, I'm a lawyer and a programmer. Primary interest, literate programming, interactive fiction, hypertext, of course, and also foresight and university futures.
Thank you. Brian, are you audibly here?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Brian Robinson, American historian, and focused on technologies that will help to increase digital content management as well as digital educational access.
Thank you. Glad to have you here. And I see David has just joined us. Do you have a 5-second intro, David?
Alert from Google Chrome.
Sure. Hi, my name is David Benjamin. I'm actually from Oakland as well, living in Tulum and working on next level web projects for hyperdimensional web.
Thanks very much. And I'm sure some people will drop in and out, as always happens. But now it's over to you, Omar.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you all for having me. I don't have anything super formal prepared, but I thought one thing that might be fun to do would, I could give a quick demo of a project I've been working on, and then maybe that would, that's a chance to then dive into some of what I've been thinking about. So let me just do that first. This top one. Okay, I have to grant access to Zoom. So this is a project that I did the initial prototype of in February. All right, I'm going to drop out and back in a second.
When he comes back in, should we pretend we're doing something entirely different?
I
can share some stuff.
Yes.
All right. So let me. Cool. So this is a project that I have been thinking about for a few years, actually, or I've been thinking about this general area for a few years. I did this prototype in February, and I haven't quite finished it up or put it up publicly, which I'm sure is an experience that a lot of people have gone through. Is the last 10% takes a lot of time. But anyway, so the basic idea of this prototype is that it's a system that watches your entire computer screen like all the time. Like it's constantly watching, monitoring everything on your computer screen. And what you can do is you can teach it to look for patterns on your screen. So and the way you teach it to look for pattern is you hit this keyboard shortcut, kind of like you're taking a screenshot. And then you can just drag out whatever pattern you want it to look for. So right now it's going to look for these 3 Mac traffic light buttons in the corner. So I'm going to drag out this pattern, let go. And so you can see that the system now detects those traffic lights and it puts a green outline around them, showing that it has a match. And I can switch windows and it matches the corner here because this looks the same. Switch to here, it matches this corner. Basically anything that looks like that, it will detect the pattern and it'll draw that green outline. So you can teach the system basically to look for anything visually on your screen. So that's the first step, is it can do this matching all the time visually. And the second step is you have this list of patterns that you've taught it to look for, and you can basically just draw on them. So I'm going to draw a triangle here. And I'll also draw a square. And then if I go over here, it matches it. It adds the 2 other buttons that I just drew. If I go over here, it adds the 2 buttons. And I can attach actions to the buttons. So here, I'll make this one say, like, I don't know, hello. And I'll make this one list the files in the folder. But they could be any actions. And so if I click this, I get a hello. If I click this, I get the files in the folders. This is kind of like the most basic type of actions that you could attach, is like just attaching scripts to these buttons. But I think it's sort of the first step to illustrate, like, I think the ideal kind of ultimate implementation of this is you can attach whatever actions are appropriate to the context, or you can make it so it does things automatically when it sees certain patterns. But I think almost as interesting as that, or maybe even more interesting. So I've added these 2 buttons. I can teach it to look for, like, if I wanted to look for this blue icon here, I could just select this, highlight it, and then I get it to match those also. Or if I want to look for the word image, I can just kind of drag that out, and then that matches. Yeah, so I think there are a few things. So that's the basic demo of this screen matching thing that I've written. I think there are a few things about it that I think are interesting that I wanted to talk about. I think first of all, I'm really interested in ways. Let me actually get a page here. So that's the basic demo. Or actually, if anybody has any questions, I can also take questions about that demo really quickly before I go into what I think is interesting about it.
I think we're just in stunned silence here. You have to give us a few more minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So this idea that, like, you have your screen, and it's just this like, it's kind of this environment, right? Like there's all this stuff out on the screen, and you kind of want to be able to just like point at things and have the computer respond to them. Kind of like, you know, like there's like Apple scripts and Apple shortcuts and things like that. But I think those, like, I like the idea that you point at the thing that's actually on the screen, that you can actually see, that's completely concrete, rather than having this like dictionary of actions where you don't like know how it corresponds to what's actually on the screen. So that's one thing, is I like the concreteness of like scripting by example, or pointing at things on the screen. Sorry, my handwriting is a mess. So I like the concreteness. I'm really interested in like, how can we, like, there's all these like different systems and universes in the computer of software that people have already written. So how can we like connect the stuff that's already out there, rather than having to make a whole new like internet, or a whole new text system, whole new web. So and a lot of my projects, I think, have this flavor of like, how can we kind of deal with the like people's existing practices, people's existing software stacks, existing technologies, and how can we kind of bridge them in some kind of, ideally some kind of like elegant, simple way. So bridging, and I think this works because it, you know, it will literally work with anything that displays stuff on your screen, right? Like the things don't need to buy into the screen matching system. The screen matching system will just work with browsers, it'll work with web pages, it'll work with video games, it'll work with PDFs, it will just work all the time. And I think that's a theme that I've been drawn to a lot. I did this project, like some other projects I've done, is I did this tab file system project, which kind of turns your browser tabs into a file system. And I think file systems to me have the same property of like, there's a lot of tools that know how to deal with files. And so if you can bridge other things into the file system, you get a lot of functionality for free pretty elegantly. I did this other screenshot project where it would kind of store the provenance and metadata every time you took a screenshot. Like you could store the URL, it could store the window title. And that I think is a similar property of like, if you use the screenshot, then it will work with anything. Even if it can't get all the metadata, it will at least get the image. And that to me is like really desirable, because, you know, I don't really like, I think it's a hard ask to ask people to throw out everything they have to adopt your new system. I think that this like interaction of like dragging out a rectangle is really satisfying. I think it's much more satisfying than selecting text. I think it's more general. I think it's underused. And so I think part of the appeal is just that I like this micro interaction. And I think it buys you into the thing you're dragging over. Like there's kind of this bodily, like, I selected this thing.
What does it search? Your computer, all of Google?
So it searches just what's on the screen. So if I you know, select, if I select this R here, then it will basically just search on my screen in the future for anything that looks like that. So it's not searching any kind of database or online or anything. It's literally just setting up automation for my computer. So there's not like a lot of intelligence in it. It's really just like a very simple way to set up little scripts or triggers for stuff in the future. So maybe I can give another example, which is kind of like, I'll give another example, which is like kind of maybe too cute, but I think it gives an idea of what's interesting about this is like, what if I wanted to set up an alarm clock on my computer? Like, let's say I want to wake up tomorrow at 7 a.m. How do I do that? Well, one answer is that you have a piece of software that's an alarm clock, and it, you know, it has an interface where you can select 7 a.m. and then it'll, you know, you leave it on and it'll play a sound at 7 a.m. tomorrow. But I think if you think about it with the screen matcher, what you could do is you have the time in the top right of your computer. You could actually set your time forward in the future to 7 a.m. tomorrow, and then it would show up here. You'd see 7 a.m. and then you could tell the screen matcher, when you see this, play a sound, and then set the time back. And so then, you know, when the clock becomes 7 a.m. tomorrow, it would play a sound. So it's almost like a way to program your computer to take actions when things happen. I think.
Could you give a practical example where it's actually used, where it has helped you? Maybe the waking up is one, but I'd like something a little more.
Yeah,
Because
I mean,
if it's only sorting on my screen, I'm not quite sure what, you know. I think it is
people are
very good. People are very good at scanning things and finding things. So I'm not quite sure what advantage it has.
Well, I mean, I think it's true that people are good at scanning things. I think that the key thing is the ability to, I mean, it is a prototype, right? So I make no claims about it being useful. I only make claims about it being like interesting or provocative. But I think the key things are the ability to attach computational actions to when it sees something, whether that's an action that happens automatically immediately when it sees something, or whether it's an action that you can just trigger inline by clicking. I think even that clicking where you have the button right there, I think that is far superior to like if you have a script somewhere on the file system to go over there and click it. Like I think the ability to attach things right on site is very important.
So then it would be, so then I'd want to have, which is an interesting idea to me, a list of actions that I like to have taken of different kinds.
Yeah.
So that I can easily attach it. Otherwise I have to do a whole lot of you know, I don't know, writing or coding or something, or selecting or clicking or whatever.
Right. Like you can certainly do anything that this can do manually, but I think that this provides a much more lightweight, like automatic, you don't have to go out of your way. And I think it would sort of, I think ideally it would get people in the habit of thinking about like, how can I automate things on a very kind of micro local basis? Bro, I guess you're raising your hand, you have a question.
I'm just trying to cover my digital hand. I slightly disagree when you said earlier it's not very smart. I think it's super smart. And I think the first thing it does that is really, really important, and I really wish Ted Nelson joined us today, he was planning to, it breaks down the ghettos between different applications. And when it comes to, I agree with you, Bob, it's so easy to scan. However, one thing that I do, I'm sure you also do, is read a lot of paper books. And what I do now, if I come across something interesting, I take a picture. So with this, I could imagine a few things that are interesting to me, having highlighted that. So when I come across something in a book, and in photos, I just go boom, boom, boom. I expect this works quite quickly. It'll get it without me having to read the pages. It also means that if I get messages from important people who are important to me, it won't just be a script for mail or messages or Telegram or WhatsApp or Facebook or Yahoo or Messenger or Google, right? Just to show how ridiculous it is. It'll find the names on screen and provide me with an opportunity to act on that should I want to. So that's really, really important. Obviously, this may very well relate to the next step, which is virtual reality, where the screen isn't a flat screen, but it is the view you're looking at. So you have this level of understanding of the view, not just machine learning of that's a dog in the corner, but to find things that relate to you. I could go on for half an hour of the excitement of this, but Fabian has a more yellow hand than me.
Quick question is, did you make any scripts or interaction based on proximity? Let's say you have two different items and that they get close enough, or also in moving windows back to change the way things are organized, let's say, like maybe snapping closer or this kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I guess that's kind of two questions. I think the question about proximity, I mean, you can do some of that right now if you just, you put the things close to each other and then you take a screenshot of them close to each other. Like that will work for some situations. I think that, I think the vision would be that you can introduce new matchers like the proximity matcher of things being close to each other, or you can like erase areas of this and then the match can stretch, right? I think there are things like that would be really interesting to play with in terms of the interface. Or like, if you want to match a form, you take a screenshot of the form and then you erase all the fields inside and then you can like suck the information out of the fields. Or you can imagine matchers where you take a screenshot of text and then it can OCR the text inside. I think that the literal screen matching that I'm showing now is very useful, and I think that it's the first thing you want. But I think there's plenty of room for, like, within this sort of framework, adding other kinds of matchers that do, you know, more advanced or more domain specific, application specific things.
David.
Yeah, so this is just my noodling on what you've shown us. This application would seem like something you would add on to a platform. So for example, if I had visual pattern matching software, that software we could say all of these things are the same. It's a poodle, right? And then you've already embedded some information about poodles. So anytime an image shows up that the visual pattern matching software has said, this is an example of this thing, you could have access to a bark or information about, and of course, and if I understand you correctly, if I have any term, I could embed a definition or other information so that anytime that term shows up on my screen, I would have access to that information.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, you could do that to some extent now, but I think that's certainly, like, I think that's the direction that would be good to go in. I think it kind of relates to what I think Freud was talking about earlier, is like, if I have a friend and I have a chat with them, I could, like, select their name. It's almost like it turns your entire computer into a hypertext system, right? Like, all your existing applications, you can just augment them with information, ideally, and add links, add actions that would float on top of what your existing applications are showing, just by doing the screen match and then displaying the additional information.
Well, you could use it for transclusion,
right? Where
you could show what's on the link end on the screen, right? So, and that's not easily done right now. So that's cool.
Right. And it will work with everything that's already out there. And I think the point you raise about it being a property, like, it really, in some sense, it feels like it should be part of the operating system or something. Like, I mean, it feels like an operation, and this is part of what's exciting about it to me, is it's this kind of universal operation, which I think is analogous to taking a screenshot, copy and paste. It's these things where it's like, you know, if I copy and paste something, like, as long as it's text, that's going to work on any program on my operating system. It will just work. And I think I think it's sad that we don't have more things like that. And so I think one of my hopes with this is, like, can we have another thing, visual matching, that's in that universe of taking a screenshot or copy and paste, that really works anywhere and feels like a reliable property of the system that I can just break out.
On that point, just before I give over to Brandel, I have a piece of software called Liquid, which uses services, and that's been around for 10, 15 years. You select text, keyboard shortcut, you could do command instantly. I agree with the thought, David, that it should be part of the system, but just because it isn't doesn't mean we couldn't have a really useful utility on top of it. And of course, we have live text on Mac now, which is hugely powerful, but it's hugely powerful in a very constrained way. So this way of having a recognition and the ability to add intelligence to it is just really, really provocative. Brandel.
I like this because in the context of application design, you know, most application designers are so agonizingly careful about what they include and exclude in a specific application. And then this is just trampled roughshod over people's ability to be able to kind of include or annotate or alter things, likely in a way that's not going to be, graphically or interactively sympathetic with the applications that you're sort of annotating and augmenting like this. And I find that thrilling because of its sort of simply transgressive nature. And it makes me think about the fact that it's like you said, there's operations inside applications, and then there's operations over applications, and they're sort of in different spaces. And how to step back, and something I really like about TabFS as well, is that it's kind of taking a step back from what is an application and what are its traditional bounds and what are those things supposed to be for, disregarding those kinds of buckets and boundaries, and saying, well, if we were to go back to what it is that a computer actually has the ability to do for us, or what we can do with it, what do we feel like and what do we play with? I'm just really excited by that as an opportunity. On a more executional level, I'm curious about the actual vision happening inside it at the moment. Are you using ML models, or are you just doing pixel diffing and stuff like that in order to be able to do that? Because yeah, it seems like it. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Continue. I can answer when you're done. Yeah.
Sure. So, because like I said, Securely is an application that uses a similar approach, but it actually has a relatively robust ML model. I think it might be open source. So that if you need to get any more capabilities out of it to be able to sort of stretch a vision definition, then it may be a useful place to go to if that's an essential part of this prototype going forward.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is just doing pixel template matching. It uses OpenCV. I think Securely, I've looked at Securely. I think it uses similar technology. I mean, I think it's interesting. There's Securely, which is kind of a scripting language where you can match images. I haven't used it, but I've looked at it. There's also this thing Prefab. The main difference between this and those is, I think, actually the interface, where you can really simply and quickly match things and attach actions. But those are both really interesting projects. And yeah, one of the things that's blocked me from releasing it is just trying to get rid of the OpenCV dependency, just because I don't want to ship it in the application. But it is basically just template matching convolution. I think, although I think again, you could have this same model and extend it to all kinds of different matching, whether that's machine learning backed, OCR, accessibility tree backed, whatever you want, HTML tree backed.
I'm going to give you over to Mark now, but I just wanted to highlight the gossip people talked about you, which is good gossip. It is the gossip that you're very provocative. And this is very different and very provocative. So I'm very grateful for all the directions the conversation goes in. Mark.
Yes, I rather, as sort of Brenda said, I like the slightly transgressive nature of this, because I sort of, but coming from a different angle. I was thinking, rather, as Bob said in his question, well, what would I use this for? But I'm thinking, and again, as someone who well, as speaking for myself, as someone who's not a coder by any skill, is there are lots of things I can imagine I want to do, and I know when I want to do them. I don't necessarily know how. And so part of the thing is turning around. It's a sort of sense of, well, if I'm in this space and if I see a blue thing, I definitely know I want the thing to happen. Now, I may not know how to do that part, but what I can definitely define sufficiently if somebody else said, if I see this, I want to have the facility to do that. Right. And that's actually really nice. It's a rather different way. And I think, as Brandon put it very nicely, so it's quite transgressive, because that's normally not how we design things. Certainly in the software world, we start by giving it very fixed boundaries for all sorts of very good reasons. But yet, what I think this neatly shows is, no, from a human perspective, I can quite quickly imagine something that is actually quite defined. I know the difference between a red dot and a green dot. Or even it's not a particularly defined shape. A thing, this thing is not that thing. And if I see one of these things, I want the facility, I want the affordance of being able to do the following things. Now, what those following things are is almost out with, I think, if I really understand, is yes, you can go and attach actions to it, but that's not really the shtick here. It's this really interesting glue of being able to say, well, no, in this situation, I now understand that I want to create this affordance that doesn't fit in a pre-programmed thing.
Just drawn on top.
Yeah. So I think that's a really powerful idea. So thanks for that. I'll pass to Peter.
Yes, this reminds me a little bit of HyperCard and the layers in it. And I was wondering whether you're intercepting mouse clicks, and would they pass through to the control underneath? Let's say what you wanted to do was change the Chrome that was associated with the traffic lights. And instead of circles, you wanted to have a custom user interface with triangles. Could you have your system overlay colored triangles over the colored circles and still have it pass the click through to the underlying operating system control?
Yes, I mean, that's not implemented right now, but I think there's no reason in principle that you couldn't do that, or you could even have it filter some clicks and not others. I mean, I think there's questions about like how you design the interface for that if you don't want it to be straight up programming interface where you type code. But I think that's totally doable. I think there's no reason in principle it can't be done.
Because My mental model of this is that you're adding a layer on top of the operating system user interface, and we're interacting with the top layer, and then
there's a giant window that covers the whole screen on which these black graffiti are drawn.
Very good, brilliant.
And it passes all the mouse events through unless you're actually on the black graffiti. Fabian, I guess you're raising your hand.
Yeah, in a way, and I'm trying to be as provocative as you are, but we should go back to pipes in the end. That Unix pipes, it's just passing one message to another. But if I were to do this, I would be dishonest. Like you, I sketch also, and I draw stuff, and I needed to think. I can't just, and I don't want to express everything in words. But that also makes me think that it's like an operating system lack of understanding of what has to be secure, because in a way what this tries to do, I believe, is enabling any software to use any other software and being controllable, manipulable, and ideally you wouldn't have to scan the screen. You would just have access to anything. You would query any data to any software. So it is because I have those little YubiKey bio using my fingerprint, and I'm not a security person, but I'm trying to pay more attention to it. I don't find it interesting, but I'm wondering if this effort highlights the deeper challenge we have, either as developer, user, or building operating system, to make the distinction between what has to be secure. Because, for example, if I have a password that is in a program, I don't want other programs to have access to it. But that's like the one case. In pretty much 99.99% of the cases, if they could better interoperate, that would be much more efficient.
Right. It's like if I'm the end user and I'm using the computer and I want to automate things, like I should have access to everything. It's my computer. I already have access to everything. And so I think to some extent, and this is kind of true, this is one of the questions that came up with the TabFS stuff also, is like how to maintain the security among applications, but expose them all to the user if the user actually wants to do something themselves. I think it's an interesting problem / question. I wanted to talk quickly about I think this is a point that's come up a few times, and I do think it is actually very important. The point about like just the kind of aesthetic like provocation of like I can just scroll on anything on my screen. I do think that is a really key component of this, and I do think it's part of what makes it attractive or interesting, is this idea that a friend of mine compared it to like Apple. He was like, Apple has this like fascist aesthetic in macOS where everything is in the right place, and this kind of subverts that. It's like you can just draw on anything. I think the point about kind of the other thing I wanted to mention, there's an interesting HCI paper about the system buttons from the early 90s, where they basically made it so you could add, I haven't used the system, but they basically made it so you could, a very simple mechanism where end users could add buttons to programs. And I think that I've thought about that a lot with respect to this when I've been working on this project, because I think it's a similar, one of the things they mentioned in this paper about buttons is it kind of creates it brings out the latent demand from end users. Because it's like once you have this idea that you can add buttons to any application, you start to think in terms of buttons. You're like, oh, I wish I had a button that could do this. Whereas before you had the buttons, you would not have had that thought. Like the system kind of generates, or it brings out demand that wouldn't have been visible before. And so I feel like there may be something similar happening here, where if you had a system like this at hand, you start to think in terms of what you could automate. You would have needs that you already had, but you weren't even able to think about, or you weren't even able to ask the questions. They would start to come to the surface. Bob?
Yes. I do a lot of visual work, and particularly diagrams. In the second Future of Text, I suggest a 1,000,000 diagram project. There are arrows in diagrams. Some arrows are straight arrows with a little pointer on the end. Some are curved. Some are wiggly in all sorts of ways. I've got probably 50 different wiggles of arrows or shapes that have meaning to people.
Right.
And I've collected something like 200 meanings that, that people have used. So the question I have with that background is, if I, surround an arrow somewhere, to what degree will it generalize arrowness?
Right. I think at the moment, so this is an area where, so right now it's a literal pixel match. Do the pixels look 95% the same? So probably it will not make that generalization. I think this is again an area where you could imagine a machine learning matcher that can classify arrows, or that can classify hand-drawn letters. Like if I draw a C, it knows that that's a C. I think that the machine learning technology is almost certainly out there to do this correctly at this point. Or you could even imagine having matchers that you can teach to make whatever classifications you care about, I think. Randall?
I would like what you were saying about sort of additional tasks that you can kind of layer on once you realize that you can get the computer to do this work for you. Something that I was doing actually for Future of Text a while ago is playing with the screen capture API within JavaScript to be able to make a web page to actually see the rest of your whole damn document. And one of the things that I was able to do with that is take a look at the Zoom participants list, and then look for the dot that indicated that somebody was talking, and just and to be able to regenerate the time log so that you could actually figure out, this person was talking from here until there. And one of the things that was really provocative about was just this recognition that there are artifacts that have relatively oblique representations that computers know about, but they don't deign to particularly tell you about, depending on the application and stuff. But you have the ability to turn those into different things. And it also reminds me of annotate.ai. I think that's the name of the company. One of my old managers used to work there. But one of the interesting things about that was the kind of the social aspect of being able to have annotation layers over the web that people can buy into and share, that sort of help protect and do mutual sense making for particular subgroups. Because you have the ability to get content about stuff that you haven't necessarily seen before, but you have circles of trust that know about certain things, and so when they see things, then they can tell each other about it.
There's a sense that the annotations are an object that you can share in themselves.
Right, because you may not necessarily know a term, or you might not know how specific sort of phrasing or imagery is actually sort of tinged on the basis of what kind of subgroups. There's a lot of just having a plug-in pack of all of the white power symbols to be able to be like, this is a white power symbol, by the way.
Right.
Have you thought about the social aspect of this, or where you'd like to take that?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that, but I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think, I think it could be really powerful. I think it's powerful partly because the mental model of this is so clear. Like if you download one of these packs, you're like, okay, it's going to look on my screen if it sees one of these things. Like that's something you can explain to anybody. And I think that means it has a lot of, and it will work in any context. You don't even need to think about like, oh, I need to open the like book reading app that has the annotations. I think, that's really interesting.
The privacy and kind of following you aspect, I think is very, very interesting, because I would like my system to follow me around a lot. If I do web browsing and it comes across things that I find interesting, story. We're currently having a Zoom meeting, and we all know the issues of having records of meetings. It will be, I know this is more putting this with a bit of machine learning, because if it sees you, because you are OSNR here, it's not even text. But it would be nice if it knows. And also Patrick has joined us, which is wonderful. But it's nice to have these things. One of the worst pieces of software Apple has is the calendar, because the calendar could, of course, also be your diary. So all the pictures you've taken, all the web pages, all of that should be there. And I could imagine this could provide an incredibly powerful layer to that, because especially with Remarkable, which is a wonderful alternative thought space, and to have that integrated. All you need to do is open it, flip through it a bit, and your system will have it integrated into the user's work. I think that's wonderful.
So, this is just an idea off the top of my head. I was thinking if you took your application, your screen matcher, and combined it with screen notate, you could do a lot of things that other applications sort of do. So for example, you know, every time something comes up, it links to a page. Right. So by putting, I think putting the two together could be very, very powerful and very super simple way to start connecting things that aren't easy to connect now.
Yeah. I think one of my hopes was that the screen annotate stuff could eventually kind of be subsumed by this, in the sense that you take a screenshot and then your action is like, okay, look up the browser title, look up the URL. Like I almost wonder if it could be a sub feature if you made the action language and the matching language rich enough, and if you could also match keyboard shortcuts, which I think is, I had actually had an idea about this, which is that this is maybe too cute, but there's this idea that how do you teach this thing to not just respond to things on your screen, but also respond when you hit a keyboard shortcut? And my thought was, well, imagine that there's an invisible keyboard above your screen and it lights up when you hit keys. And then you can teach this thing, but you can take a screenshot of the invisible keyboard and make it respond to keyboard shortcuts when you hit the keys and they light up.
I love that. That reminds me of the direct memory state of graphics memory. Just the reality of how actual internal representations exist. If you devote some part of your sort of nominal display surface to any of the statefulness that exists within something, then you have the ability to do that. And even doing things like smart home, you'd be able to do smart home automations where you just make sure that you devote a particular part of your visual real estate to the state of all of those. And to the same thing to any sensors that you have. So if you have a leap motion or anything, that's you say it's cute, and I mean, in an immediate sense it is, but like depending on the kinds of inputs and sensors that you wish to kind of provide, then it means that you have an absolutely minimal sort of area of glue over which you can kind of represent those things, and the protocol essentially just becomes being able to have pixels on the screen. It's really exciting.
And it becomes something that where like the end user, you can inspect it and see what's going on, because everything is mappable to pixels that you can understand. I think there's an analogy to the Unix philosophy where, in Unix, it's like everything goes through plain text, right? You like things come out as plain text, you can look at them, you can pipe them into other things. And here, I think one of the provocations is like, what if everything comes out as images and you can match images instead of plain text? And in some ways that's, and like, how much can you do with that? And I think my hope is that you can actually do quite a lot, and it's kind of just better than using text.
Yeah, well, one of the failures of Unix in that regard is that it wasn't really like the philosophy is sound, and I think TabFS is a real reflection of that. But one of the challenges is that text is not a very good representation of streams and continuously varying data, which is the world we live in with regard to computers these days. And so when you're talking specifically about sort of sensor inputs, and a keyboard is one of them, more discrete. But if you have pressure sensitivity on a tablet or or having activity related to a webcam, then those are a lot more subtle. And so you have to have things that you can drive slightly fuzzier determinations of over vastly more varying sort of data sources. But I think it's really, really interesting. It's an opportunity.
In terms of provocations, the thing that, I don't know, I guess some of you here are also photographers, amateur or otherwise. And I remember in the olden times, people would say, oh yeah, just move that subject over there. It's like, no, it's a flat image. There is no foreground and background. Oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And then Apple Worldwide Developer Conference, why don't you just tap on the subject and move that into a message? Right, so the amount of processing that's now available, and also with live text, before, oh, it's a flat PDF. Well, now it's kind of a flat PDF. Oh, it's just a picture of text. I mean, one thing that I found amazing with my own work with Author is that if I do the thing of taking a picture of a book, if I then go and just open it in Photos, copy whatever text from that page, go to Author and paste that as the basic for a citation, it'll find the damn book. because it uses Google Books. It's just crazy, right? So what you're doing here is taking another really important step in screw history, screw all the fancy computer terms. You're acting like a 14-year-old, which is really a huge compliment here, because you know, as things become no longer research, we no longer talk about machine learning. In many cases, you know, you just speak to Siri, right? And if you look 20 years ago, speaking to Siri would be near impossible. You're really doing that by saying there's stuff on your screen. The end user shouldn't have any barrier to doing whatever that user wants to do in whatever app it is, whatever form it is, whatever result they want at whatever time scale. It's really, I don't have anything other to say than lots of really interesting wows and dimensions.
Thanks. Yeah, it's really exciting. It kind of surprises me that it hasn't been done already, at least in this form.
Well, that's the thing. And, you know, I haven't talked about Liquid, my little software, in so long, but since you say that, I developed Liquid a long time ago. I first developed it for the web, and it was select text, get a little dot, you'd select it, you can choose option. Really, really simple. And then many years later, Internet Explorer had one. You know, that was a blue square. It wasn't a round silver dot. And it was much more shit than ours. And I think the reason is Microsoft is a big company, we are not. So you have all these layers of management that all have to fiddle with the product. So I think what you've done here is really, really simple in that sense. I don't think a big company could easily do something like this, but maybe Brandel would disagree with me.
No, I mean, one challenge, you know, with application design is that it sort of suits top-down kind of siloed organizational structure, and so that, you know, having one team making one application, and that the implications for other applications are minimal beyond, you know, agreeing on some kind of protocol for what a date is. Again, something that Excel has not succeeded in phenomenally. But you know, I think that it's what's really interesting. So Screen Matcher is awesome. What it makes me want to do is go like, what is the sort of the domain and the sort of the perimeter of domain for application design in a world where Screen Matcher is ubiquitous and a given part of the operating system. Like if you were to say, like, if you know, Microsoft or Apple or whatever, like, may wave a magic wand and turn this into a reality, not claiming that it will. Like, what would that mean? Application designers would tend to do and tend to omit, and what are the ways in which they would even, you know, present an application after that as a consequence? You know, because you know, some things may be best as a core application, but maybe some things are actually better delivered in Screen Matcher as a set of optionals and additions and things like that. I think that's a really interesting thing to play with as well. Like, have you thought about, like, if you were to build applications into a Screen Matcher world, what you would do differently as a consequence?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Like, there's some sense in which, like, what is the grain of like the Screen Matcher thing? I think there are a few. I think one is you try to put as much information on the screen as possible, kind of collated, so that the matcher can pick it up. And so you can imagine, and you could even imagine layers of this, right? Where maybe you have applications or you have things embedded in Screen Matcher where all they do is just transform information on the screen into other forms of information on the screen so that they can be picked up by other matchers.
That's
yeah. Yeah.
The idea that you would make an application that actually isn't human readable at all, and actually shows the control panel, and actually the faceplate is the Screen Matcher sort of stuff on top of it, is really fun to think about.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about this is that it is it's not quite visible with these basic examples, but in a way it is kind of just a programming model, one which works based on visual pattern matching rather than if statements or loops or whatever. Like, I think there are quite a few things that you would think of as programming that you could probably do with a visual model like this if it were designed in the right way.
I can think of an application that I would use today probably 10 times, and each day after that at least 10 times. When I'm reading something, I run into a word. Sometimes it's the name of a company. Sometimes it's the name of, it's several words. Sometimes it's a word that I'm unfamiliar with. And I will copy it and paste it into Google or a search engine. And when the search engine comes up, I will click on the page and hope to make and wish that it would make a new open a new whole page so that I could go on reading what I've been reading, and then click, and it's done all that stuff in the background so that I could, if I still wanted to know that word that I'm unfamiliar with, I could just click once over to the other screen, the other window that's open. And so that's what I would do this afternoon with it. If
Right. Right. Yeah. Right. But I think, I think my hope or my thought is that like everybody kind of has, 2 to 5 to 10 things like this that they do that you wouldn't even like, if I watched over your shoulder, I would see you like doing things like this, but you might not even think of it. Like, I feel like there are probably a lot of these things that people don't even think of as like something that they could automate. But if you have this kind of automation at hand, that's very simple, that you don't even have to think of it as an automation. You're kind of just like taking a screenshot,
right? That
it would then generate this sort of, you just do all these things.
Oh, and then it would store it in a database of all the things that I looked up like that.
Right.
Which, somewhere on my computer, so that I could go back to it. Ah, yes. Well, all right. There's my application.
You're sold. Yeah. Fabian?
Because you mentioned automation, I'm wondering if it could be valuable to maybe combine with eye tracking or some way to see where you're paying attention before you do an action, so that you don't have to explicitly select an area before you run and say, okay, this is where I look every time before I do this shortcut, or you run that program or something like this.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that feels like that kind of fits in this realm of like, how do you deal with other sensors, whether that's how you respond to keyboard shortcuts, maybe you can respond to where the mouse is. I feel like eye tracking should also, ideally there's some framework in which all of these things fit, whether it's like there's an extra screen, there's a virtual screen where all these things be matched, or maybe you can like you can brush like the mouse needs to be here on this pattern, and it can match that. I'm not totally sure, but I think that's like an interesting question.
So,
Peter?
I think in some ways, you're in this area that Lanier wrote about in Who Owns the Future? Because what we have is this paradox where all this information, the storehouse of human knowledge, is at people's fingertips, and yet information overload, information anxiety, all these poor educational preparation is keeping people, so-called average people, from being able to really tap in and realize the potential of the internet for solving complex problems and being innovative and creative. And then when you look at, let's say, the curriculum to become a data scientist, I mean, a lot of people can't get past Algebra 1. And so I think what you're building here is part of the eventual tool set for just plain folks to be able to make a living in the future doing knowledge work. Right. You don't need to be a data scientist. You shouldn't have to be a data scientist. It's just
right. It's like, get rid of this cliff between, I'm using the computer and okay, I know how to like program, I know how to write scripts, I know how to use the terminal. Like there's a huge kind of, that like the step from one to the other is big, and there's not really anything in the middle. Peter, I think you're raising your hand, and I think we didn't get to you.
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your project that exposes browser tabs as files in the file system.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So I don't know if folks have looked at that or if they're familiar. I don't think I have it running on this machine, but basically what it does is you have your browser open. So here I have 3 tabs open. What this project TabFS does is it creates a virtual file system on your computer. So there's literally like a folder, and then each of these tabs would appear as a subfolder in that virtual file system. So they appear in Finder. They look like real folders, and so what that means is that there's all these operations that you can do on files, right? Like you can list them, you can search for information inside a file, you can delete them, you can move them around, you can copy them to other places, and so you have all these operations that there's lots of software out there that can operate on files, text files, etc. And so what this TabFS project does is it basically maps your browser tabs into that space. So now you can just delete a file and it'll close that tab. So if you want to close all your Zoom tabs or close all your email tabs, you can just do like RM star, whatever, or you can delete them in Finder. Whatever way you already know how to delete files, you can use that to delete tabs. Whatever way you already know how to copy files, you can use that to like archive all the tabs you have open at a particular time. Or if you want to do statistics, you can have it sample the tabs at any given time. Like there's a lot of things that are like, I don't even know how to do these with the stuff that's open in my browser because I'd have to write a browser extension or something. But what this TabFS thing does is it maps the browser tabs into this space of the file system where I already have operations I can do. And people were really excited by that. I haven't worked on it in a few months, but I still think it's really cool work. And it has this similar property of having these operations that I know how to do and bridging these different informational universes of the web browser and the desktop computer that right now are pretty disjoint.
Yeah, one of the needs to be spied on by yourself.
Right. Right. It's like, if you want to do something, like you should be able to, part of me feels pretty strongly, you should be able to ignore, like a lot of these things are in place for security. And so I feel like if it's me that wants to do something, I should be able to break through those security barriers that prevent me from accessing websites from my computer or vice versa. Shwell.
Hey, Omar, I'm curious, how do you kind of get the idea for this screen matcher and the tab? Like, what gets you to think about this, making this project?
Yeah. It's funny because both of these were projects that I had been thinking about for a few years. I'd kind of been developing in my head before I actually got to them. So the screen matcher I went on this retreat in February, and I was like, okay, this is my excuse to actually do this. I think that there is inspiration from a bunch of places. The Plan 9 operating system from Bell Labs, they did a lot of this sort of mapping things into file systems and then operating them on them as files. And so partly the inspiration was, when they did Plan 9, they didn't have web browsers and browser tabs. When they did Unix and everything is a file in Unix, they didn't have web browser and browser tabs. So how can we take that philosophy and apply it to the objects that we actually have on the computer now? Which is something that people hadn't done before. But I think that's always like a good thing to think about, is like, the ways in which we use computers are actually quite different now than they were in 2000, 1990, 1980. And so when there are new computational objects, how can we apply some of these older philosophies and bring them forward? And I think people really connect with that. I think it's a lot easier to think about everything as a file or like Plan 9 or whatever when you actually see your browser tabs with your Facebook or your Twitter or whatever applied that way. I think, another inspiration for the screen matching stuff, I think Unix philosophy, this idea of taking these things that are about text and applying them to images. There's a system Viewpoint that Scott Kim did at Stanford in the 80s. That's also where it's kind of like everything's on the screen. It was also a big inspiration for Dynamic Land. I think that's a big inspiration. This idea that like the state of the system is on screen and you do things with respect to the visual state. Dynamic Land also kind of worked this way, by the way. The idea that like you could take a photograph of a table at Dynamic Land, which was this research lab I was working before, and then that would be a kind of full snapshot on the system. So I think a theme in my thinking for the last few years has been this kind of like, what does a visually oriented computer and how like so many things are visually represented to the human on the computer screen, and how can we use that computationally? Plan 9 also has this editor Acme, which I think is a relative of Oberon from ETH in the 70s or 80s, which is kind of like hypertext, like all the text is matchable system. And so I think that's taking that kind of text concept and applying it to images, also an inspiration. So yeah, I don't know, I run into a lot of different things and try to synthesize them and bring them into a more modern context.
Awesome, thanks. Can you also provide some update on the dynamic land and how I had fortunate to visit one a couple of times before. Like, is there what's the new? Is there new things there and update?
Yeah, I'm not fully up to date. I think the last I heard was from Brett was in December. If you shoot me a message, I can forward you that update. I think that they are embedded in, I think Brett and maybe one other person are still working on it. I think they're going to be working on it. They're embedded in a lab at UCSF with a friend of ours who's a professor there. So I think they're going into a phase where they want it to be very concrete and like embedded in this existing lab's work, which I think is healthy. But yeah, the dynamic land space itself has closed down. It was certainly like pretty underutilized during the pandemic, so I think that's a good move. Yeah, as far as I know, they're still working on it, and if you reach out, I can maybe forward you the updates that I have, but I'm not fully up to date.
Thanks.
Fabian?
Yeah. One question I need to ask, and but maybe it was even addressed. I don't know. Was about because as soon as you see you showed OpenCV at the beginning, I was like, oh, faces, because there were some people who can't really remember people's name and what they've done, what they discussed before. And here we're on Zoom, we see each other's face. We had a discussion like this last week also on Twitter. So in a way, and I'm tinkering with AR again for fun and for money, because I think it is in the end pretty interesting medium. But what you show to me, it's like a virtual augmented reality in the sense that you augmented the screen. It is a pretty ideal scenario. Like, for example, the contrast is perfect. There is no light showing.
But it always looks the same. No.
Yes, and it's super coherent. Okay, scale might change, but maybe not even. Like, for example, the buttons you're showing, they are exactly the right ones.
Yeah.
But all that to say that it makes me, I think, for people who get excited by AR but don't really know what to do with it, or they just see marketing videos and whatnot, I think what you show is a great way to get them thinking, because in a way you can transport that to the in situ knowledge work where you're looking at your table, looking at your desk, shuffling paper all around and all that, because when we're going to, at some point, wear those nice, powerful enough glasses, then yeah, we can transpose whatever functions, let's say, we started to tinker with through your work to everything else, basically. Some things being much harder, like, I don't know, objects like this. I don't think we're going to be able to easily recognize this or bind functions to it for quite a while. But anyway, I think it's really useful as a way to do, to project on what those functions are going to be.
Yeah, and I think that feels, I haven't worked that much with AR stuff, but that also, I think it's also important from a philosophical point of view, where I think, it feels to me like the dominant mode of thinking when it comes to AR stuff is this kind of like Google, Facebook, Apple, Siri. What it will do is it will overlay, we will kind of in the back end synthesize whatever information we think is useful for you, and then we'll overlay it as you're looking around. It's kind of, and you don't do anything, right? You don't come up with actions, you don't come up with augmentations. The system is just sort of smart, and it just surfaces everything automatically. And I think that is useful, but I would hope that we can do something a little bit more active where you also can make augmentations, and you can make actions, and you can, the computer should serve you, and you should be able to tell it ways that it can help you. And I think that's one of the hopes of this work. I think that's also a hope of the dynamic land stuff, where it's people can come in and make their own objects and their own augmentations and attach their own content to things in the ways that they find useful. Mark?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's actually interesting in sort of thinking in a virtual XR sort of context is where this has thing in a virtual plane, in the sense of imagine we have to imagine, there's some task, you're being given things, it doesn't really what there are, but some things are different from other things. And you have the realization that these things are of a type.
Mhm.
So akin to I may not even have a name for it, or it may be in
Right.
a language, it may have a name in a language I don't speak, but I absolutely know that this thing is not that thing. Now I've identified this thing. I may not only want an affordance on it, but usefully, any future arrival of that object would have the
Mhm.
same affordance. And if I needed to go back, as it were, or I needed to look at the bucket of things on the floor, of the past things, that they would also would acquire the same extra affordances.
Yeah.
Because so that the small but complex thing the human part of me has done is that I recognize the pattern here.
Yeah.
I recognize a pattern which most of us would struggle to write down in a nice form that someone would then go away and reasonably program. But we can fairly instantaneously, right, I see a thread here. And I basically want to mark that.
Yeah.
So it's a slightly tangential thing to what you're doing, but I can see another way in which that has a really useful affordance, especially in a sort of a virtual environment, where you might even be able to do things like if you were looking, for instance, in some way, whether it was a game or work, that you were processing a flow of something, you could almost sort of turn the thing back the other way. So let me flip back to the front. And, oh, look, the thing that I only spotted halfway through now is a known type of entity.
Yeah.
Because in effect, I've been able to use that, and I've effectively used a visually based labeling on it. And I take in mind what Fabian said about the fact that on a screen, there's the image is probably arguably more fixed than it might be in a more dynamic environment. But nonetheless, I find that an interesting provocation too, as a way to use this sort of thing. And it's and reflecting what you were saying about so well, let's move on from where we were 30 years ago. What can we do now with these new things? So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting question, and it reminds me of what Bob was talking about earlier. I think about could this system classify if I draw a bunch of different arrows and they have different meanings to me, can it classify those arrows? And I think like the first answer is no, because the system doesn't know what the arrows mean to you. But I think the second answer is, what if you have a machine learning system that's like a servant of this system that like lives in a little box on your screen or in your AR world or whatever, and you can teach it to be a classifier as part of this matching system. Like it's not that the machine learning system is in charge, it's the matching system is in charge, but it can use the machine learning system. You can kind of teach it and mold it to do whatever classification is appropriate for you specifically.
Or even in the more narrow context, you just said, now I know that this thing is, in a sense, this is now an entity I recognize as a discrete thing. Yeah. Just go find all the other, not so much go find, just be aware that whenever one of these things turns up, even if I haven't seen it yet, or I saw it previously, or it's behind me or something, that this system, my sort of computer environment is now able to capture that and add a richness to it without me having to go through a very formal process of definition.
Right.
I think that's tremendously powerful.
Yeah, I think that partly works because it's this live, ongoing, on all the time system. Whereas if it's an app that you have to launch, then of course you have to like set up the whole thing while you have the app open. But if it's on all the time, maybe even it gets it wrong sometimes, and that's fine. You just say, okay, you got it wrong, learn from this. That's fine. It's not a big deal.
Edgar just wanted to say hi. He's wearing his suit that he's going to be wearing for a family wedding this summer. Look at Edgar. Look at this, huh? How amazing does he look? The joys of Amazon.
He looks like a tiny Vincer.
Yeah. Believe it or not, this is all Amazon. It's just crazy.
Wow.
Anyway, he just wanted to say hi, and best special effect out there, aren't you, Edgar? Right, sorry.
Like a tiny Vincer.
No.
Yes. Fabian.
Yeah, tiny Vincer. To jump back on the virtual AR or on the I got a little bit confused. But anyway, an idea that prompted me with this experiment is doing this motion, like when we make a photo, let's say, using our hands, or like a frame rather. And I'm wondering if this could become a rather interesting in VR shortcut or gesture rather, that I posted on the chat, like a little experiment on manipulating code in VR. And what I do is I pinch to start code, but rather what could be done instead, following again this principle of grabbing visually something, is you do this gesture of defining the frame, and then you do some raycasting with it, that frame, so that if you see something, an object, whatever 3D element, then it becomes a selector or way to start then a trigger an action instead.
Interesting. I'll have to look at that. Yeah, that does feel very related.
That's similar to Pranav Mistri's Sixth Sense MIT Media Lab project back in the day, having a sort of a chest-mounted camera and having the ability to do that. But yeah, I think that within a sort of a ubiquitous computable environment, it's not necessarily something that's attached to your face or your body, but could be like dynamic land being in space,
right?
Being able to recognize those gestures and kind of call time out on normal operations. And like we were saying before about the sort of the idea that you have the operation of programs and then you have the operation on programs, and and being able to kind of switch between those to be able to kind of modify that behavior is really interesting and provocative. Something I was really interested about in thinking in the context of TabFS is the sort of this transposition of similar but not quite identical kind of domains. So like a tab system can be understood as a tree, and we have a lot of these kind of abstract types. But it's really powerful to be able to kind of fully pull them through into this other kind of world. I don't know if it's something that you were thinking of or playing with, but WinFS was something that I was breathlessly excited about at the time that it was kind of discussed and announced, and bitterly disappointed as it was kind of.
This is the Windows,
crushed.
The Longhorn,
right,
the database,
right. And having that fully relational file system where your email was actually just going to be a folder that happened to have email files in it, and that your contact list would just be the directory that contained people files, and all the terrifying things that entails. I'm curious, like, what other sort of areas of transposition would you consider, or have you considered that just don't work now, or that you haven't got around to? Like, what other sort of worlds do you see equivalences between that you'd like to play with?
I think it's a really good question. I think one that has come up a couple times is, I think, chat messages, both as a target and as a source. Actually, I think the chat messages are they're not quite as rich as files, but they have a similar kind of like, it's an interface that you can map things into, and it kind of frees you from the decision of what to name a new object, because you just type into the chat box at the bottom and hit send. I think there's a lot of excitement about SQLite, especially recently. I don't know the exact cause of this. I think that's an interest. Like, I kind of wonder if we should all just learn SQLite and get really fluent with it. I think that the ergonomics of it are not as good as with files, but it's significantly more powerful. There are various systems where people have mapped things to be SQLite virtual tables. I think Facebook has one where they map the metrics of their data center into SQLite, and then they can be queried as SQL. I mean, dynamic land kind of work this way also. Like, basically in dynamic land, this state of all programs, like where the programs are on the table geometrically, the variables inside them, what the computer vision system was seeing, all these things were basically in a single queryable database. And so you could just write scripts and debugging tools like extremely quickly that were like 1 or 2 lines and see the output. And as you were developing your program, you could see the data that was flowing through. So I think, I think the kind of SQL data querying model, I wish the ergonomics of it were better, or that I were more fluent in it, but I think it is maybe the right way to do things compared to a file system.
So when my beautiful boy just came in, I took a picture of him, and that reminded me of a point I wanted to bring up. And that is, I now have invested in this insanely incredible camera. It's 47 megapixels. And there's two reasons I'm bringing that up. One is it seems to be a lot of us in the industry, including especially the early pioneer guys, at some point they become photographers, which I find absolutely fascinating. Even Jeff Rulofson is all totally photographer now, you know. So the other side of that is I have, for my whole life, since being a teenager and carrying cameras and rolling my own film, wanted to capture a kind of reality. And I've always kind of gotten close. I remember the Canon 5D Mark II was really amazing, et cetera, et cetera. But now that I've stepped up, I mean, if you look at Marshall McLuhan, who said that quantity changes what something is. For instance, if you show one image and then another one, you do it quickly enough, suddenly you have a movie. So quality can change media. The thing that I've been wrestling with from an artistic perspective over the last week is that this camera is so gosh darn good that anything I snap will be technically insanely high quality. So from one perspective, anything will be great work. So does that make the photographer more lazy or more hardworking? That's a fun question. But the question I'm bringing up to you guys is, can we imagine, because I was thinking, you guys have mentioned Doug and Ted and all these people. When Doug was around, there was no Zoom. We couldn't have had this kind of a meeting because I was hoping it would have been nice back in the day if you could have joined us. But if we can imagine in the future, when we have normal displays and normal cameras for video that does 47 megapixels live, you know, looking at the kind of intelligence and the thinking that you're doing, what can we do when it's no longer in the rarefied form, but it's accessible to us? It will be something different yet again, won't it? Just a question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can, I mean, to some extent, like even this, it's like just on the cusp, but like it does take like 50, 100 milliseconds to do a match. Like it would have been sort of impractical 10 years ago. It would have been very impractical 20 years ago. I think you can see this with some of the machine learning stuff. I think that is an area that's very clearly, that's very clearly going to benefit. I mean, I think it's not out at the end user yet, except in these kind of very specific Apple, Google applications. But I think it's interesting to think about like what can it do on your computer. It's funny, like graphics processing, it's like it's used by video games, but it's not really used in the kind of end user GUI. That's something I've always thought was funny. I don't know if other people have thoughts.
I was on mute. I do have a thought. So Battlefield 2042 has been decried for having problems here, there, and whatever. They have updated it over the last week with better interactions. And I know it's a traditional game, it's running gun and all of that stuff, but it really highlights that polish and speed matters so much. It's a completely new game. You know, it really makes such a difference. So when you're talking about the speed of interaction, Doug, to bring him up again, I'm sure most of you know the story. He said that if you don't have instant interactions, it's like skiing downhill, you're going to fall over. Brandel.
Yeah, I totally agree in terms of the practical consequences of latency on people's ability to do stuff. There's some really interesting work on brain-computer interface where people look at sort of varying latency artificially of input and of output, and they actually have different profiles in terms of how the degradation of the tasks occur. I mean, they both do, but actually, if you have immediate updates but less immediate sort of feedback, then the degradation is less bad than if you have delays for when your impulses result in actual impacts on the system. But I wasn't going to talk about modern stuff. I was going to talk about King Charlemagne, and in the context of having these abilities now versus in the past, and how it defames or descales photography. I feel like it's relevant, so bear with me. So Charlemagne was illiterate, and one of the things that he's was responsible for was unifying type through the empire that he was responsible for at the time. Carolingian minuscule was something that he decided needed to be designed, but didn't know how to do reading and writing. It wasn't necessary to him, but also it was sort of an expert discipline, being able to do reading and writing in the same way that the great big tech billionaires don't know all of the technical capabilities that the people underneath them are responsible for. But not because they were stupid. Charlemagne obviously knew that it was good to be able to write nice lowercase letters, but it was a deeply technical subdomain, and it remained that way for a long time. But ultimately, we figured out kind of a world, not just like the sort of teaching curriculum, but also a world in which writing was possible to do, but then writing became necessary to do, and it's possible to imagine any number of skills and or sort of evolutions thereof that are currently incredibly arcane, that just become taken as read, and it's definitely the case that people don't write as well as scribes did. For the most part, although some of them went crazy and just wrote gibberish in the middle of books, and it took centuries for people to realize because the books kind of didn't mean that actually for the people reading them. But yeah, like I think that it's really interesting to think about just the sheer defanging of reading and writing that occurred as a consequence of that. And same thing. Henry Ford, for all his very many flaws, like defanged the sort of the production line and assembly, and turned it into something that was nearly ubiquitous to be able to do as long as you had the gear for it. So yeah, I think it fundamentally changes photography to have this stuff being ubiquitous. Although the price tag on the Leica by no means makes it ubiquitous. But if somebody else were to make a big camera, then maybe it changes it. And, iPhone certainly has done quite a lot of that in terms of the caliber of photography people are able to take with them. And yeah, like I think it maybe devalues aspects of what it is that people do with photography, but it also allows you to fundamentally change what in a literal sense, like the conversation is with these media and artifacts, because people are able to kind of produce them effortlessly and then express through them in a way that isn't really possible when people have to be thinking about what they're doing with them. And so, yeah, I find it perfectly acceptable to mourn the loss. I think that actual film transfer photography has some really interesting artifacts and sort of facets to it that are now all but impossible to reach because of the way that digital photography is fundamentally, like, totally and completely crowded out. But yeah, I'd be really excited by what the future of photography is once it's so easy for people to take such breathlessly photos that's not a differentiating factor at all.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, like I on Twitter, people have mourned, the loss of like dial-up internet, and it is true. Like there are a lot of nice things about having fast internet, but it is also true that like, there is something about like you have to dial up. You're online means you're online. People can talk to you. Like there are things that are lost in any technological change, and it's just going to be different.
That was provocative. Things will be lost. Now you sound like an old man, opposite of earlier today. I know that well, I mean, if we look at McLuhan, he talks about the media tetrad. He talks about how media will reverse in on itself, which is very interesting. An example he used, which I think is really provocative, was that in the age of automation, we will all become our own secretaries. That most certainly happened. So the hot and the cold, a lot of the stuff we talk about in this group on and off is brain stuff, especially Brandel being an expert on that. And the more I learn about the human brain, the more I learn that we're intensely ignorant of so many aspects of how it works, because we're evolved creatures. So it's really hard to see outside our component, so to speak. And this was one of the things that came up in my Viva this summer. I had written something in intentionally loose and childish terms to highlight that we don't know it. It's not academically known. So now I'm doing a bit of reading, and by the way, I can strongly recommend this book. It's mostly obvious, but it's obviously important as well. So when you're talking about things are lost, it's really, it's nice. I mean, every once in a while, we still need carving stone for specific uses. But different media succeed for different uses. There is, of course, a loss in that when you have convenience, like in evolution, satisficing is what works. If it works, next generation. Doesn't have to be perfect, obviously. Similarly with technology, like MP3s were significantly worse quality in the beginning than the file formats that came before. But that's only for the people who give a damn. For the vast majority of people, it's simply I can fit it on my iPod. I think that's got a lot to do with what we're talking about here. And as developer thinking people, I think it is really easy for us to polish and be perfect, as we have to for a user, but in a different way for ourselves. And we will polish things that no one cares about. That's a bit of a danger. So someone who really invests in, let's say, photography will, of course, take very different pictures from someone who uses a point and shoot that happens to be insanely advanced, like an iPhone. But I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but what is really fascinating is the new opportunities for the kind of pictures. And I remember one of the Google guys, I don't know which one of the two, when they had the Google Glass thing. And he said that someone asked him what he's doing and he was having lunch. So he just snapped and sent that as a reply. And that was such a transformative thing for him. We do that now with our iPhones and stuff, with our phones. And that's an actually crazy thing. If we think 20 years ago, I mean, how do you communicate with the rest of the family? Yes, I love my beautiful boy, but I can instantly send a 1-minute video in HD over a phone network for anyone in the family to see. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. If somebody from that time period will complain about the lighting or that it wasn't Rec 709 or whatever it might be, but we don't care. So going forward, especially with your liberating layer on top of whatever the technology is, I think it's going to be really hard to understand the implications of that, but it's going to be really, really amazing. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
Just throw it. It's funny, Frode, because we're watching this 19-year-old girl walking the Appalachian Trail with her iPhone, and she's broadcasting to the world in high definition color, right? And telling a story and being followed by thousands of people. And I was saying, gee, when we were 19, that you wouldn't even imagine that possibility. But just getting to this image thing, Omar, maybe you could comment on this. Museums since around 2000 have been digitizing their collections. In fact, Google has supported a lot of high definition. And I have a friend of mine that's consulting to about 6 or 7 museums because they're trying to figure out how do we add value to these collections? Because just because you have pictures of all of these amazing artifacts, how do you make them useful, not only to scholars, but to people in general? And it just occurred to me, one of the things that's happening in museums is a paradigm shift with a focus on social justice and education, becoming almost like a second school. And the social justice piece is like my museum has a collection of indigenous American artifacts. We've never let the tribal people actually curate their own stuff. Let's do that, right? So I'm wondering, I actually have a question here is, can you imagine using Screen Matcher and Screenotate as sort of a very simple tool that people could use to, in a kind of augmented reality sense for, let's say, I'm going to curate a collection, the museum collection, from the perspective of an indigenous person who doesn't have the technical skills, but can certainly learn your applications. And then do you imagine being able to share the results? And then finally, how might this work with video? With you have an object and it would be on the screen, and while it's on the screen, you have access to, that's the augmented piece.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the question about like, can you share annotations is one that came up earlier. I think it's something that I hadn't thought about, but I think it's a great idea. And I think when you have any programming system, and I do think of this on some level as a programming system, the social element of it is very important. I think whether it's Excel, whether it's HyperCard or whatever, I think like that is a lot. Like you can't just look at the system in a vacuum. It's like, I think the social context matters a lot. So I think it's a great point. Yeah, I mean, I think I hadn't thought about that specific use, but I do think like I certainly think it's a better world where people are using a tool like this that has a very clear mental model that can be extended, that is like relatively simple glue. as opposed to, we do a contract with a bunch of software developers and we have them make this giant web app to like annotate everything. And then we have to go hire them back every time we need to change it and we don't really understand how it works. Like, I would hope that the future looks more like you have tools like this that are, very simple, very well understood, have a very clear model, even for end users who don't necessarily know much about computers. Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting because listening to David speak there, because when he said sort of annotations, I was actually sort of thinking more in terms of Bush's trails, because I find annotations a rather squirrely term, because other people's annotations that broadly they wrote for themselves often travel really badly, because we don't realize how intimate our own method of annotation is.
Right. Whereas trails have a certain structure.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's an interesting, and I don't think it invalidates the idea at all. What it makes me think about is applying some focus to the fact that not all annotations are the same for the same purpose. So annotating with the intent that it would be read by another person, or at least
that's if I just jump in, that's social reading, and there's a social reading etiquette which says I'm writing this as a publication, not for my own, because annotation started as a totally private thing when the Gutenberg, in the scholarly times, they used to pass books around and people would write in the margins to each other.
Yeah.
Right. And then it became private, and people have to understand, no, this is social reading. It's different than private reading.
I totally agree. I sense in all the wonderful modern things that we're allowed to do that we've come round to the other problem, that we've forgotten that these are two perfectly valid but slightly separate things. So more often than not at the moment, we confuse effectively private annotation with public reading, or whatever term we give it. They're all a form of annotation, but they speak to a different purpose. Anyway, that was the sort of the thought riffing through my head.
Brandon?
On the subject of sort of conflating terms, Bob, if you haven't heard of Bob Horn, the guy who was here earlier, his textbook, Mapping Hypertext, is unfortunately out of print, but really interesting in the context of things like the idea of following through hypertext. And one of the things that he does is distinguish between behavior that he calls browsing, which is undirected and somewhat naive, versus more directed network hypertext navigation activity. And I think it's really interesting that we now use just the term browser to describe both the program and the activity of using it, which was at that time the least valuable and the least focused one. In terms of losing the distinction between colors. Oh, I'm lost. Sorry. If you can still hear me, then that's good. Everybody is frozen on screen, so I wasn't sure if I had dropped out. The question I had was, we talked a little bit.
We can see you and hear you, Randall. So just keep going. You're okay.
You can still hear me perfectly?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just thought maybe I had completely frozen. I'll just bear with it. One of the things that people brought up just then was end users, and something that I'm fairly acutely aware of, at least in the browser world, is that 90% of people on desktop computers don't actually even know how to find on page. And so I absolutely applaud new sort of programming paradigms and environments that people can sort of supercharge to be able to give new capabilities. But do you see either Screenannotate or TabFS or any of the other projects as things that sort of point a way to providing to be able to lift the bottom of computing sort of capability and literacy? Because engineers and programmers, people who are willing to invest the time to understand things well, will be able to do really well from any kind of ability. But how do you raise the bottom? Have you played with that, or what do you think with these projects or others that you would be able to do with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's like a little bit of slippage between the goal of how do I help myself? Which I think is also a major, I think that's probably, if I had to pick, I think that's the goal that I'm picking, is like, I want to make something that I can use that lifts the bar for me. And I think, this is, a lot of these systems are approachable for end users, but they are also useful even for me, even though I know how to program, just because there are so many weird barriers that they can remove. But I think that the question of raising the bar for end users is a really important one. And I think it's also one, there's something, I've tweeted about this before, there is something very compelling about the idea of end user programming. And I think people are very drawn to it who have engineering backgrounds. And I think there are a few reasons for this. I think one is that, if you have a world where end users can program, it simplifies, a lot of things. Like we can have much simpler systems, we can have much clearer systems if you just assume a little bit more knowledge on the part of end users. Yeah, and it's a question that I think a lot of my projects try to get at in different forms. I think the most obvious, like if you think about end user programming, I think usually the approach people take is, how do we make programming easier? Like, do we have blocks? Do we have, like a tutorial? Do we have visualizations? And so you can think of the Screen Matcher stuff as like, if you think of it as a programming interface, it's maybe another answer to that question of like, how do we make programming easier? But I think there are other questions that are also important of like, how do we motivate programming? How do we give you useful things you can do right away if you learn how to program? I think TabFS almost gets to this of like, okay, if you learn a little bit about the terminal, you can like close half your tabs, or like there are very simple things you can do immediately, as opposed to like having to learn Python and like learn how to do all these things before you can do anything useful. This is also why people like Excel, right? It's like you can just make a list in Excel. You don't need to know the formula language. It's useful immediately. So I think that question of like, how can we motivate programming by giving you a curve where you're immediately able to do, you're immediately effective in some sense, is another important question. I think the question of how you can socially motivate programming is also important. And this is kind of what the dynamic land stuff gets at. It's like you're in a context where everybody else is programming all the time. All the artifacts on the table are programs. So like in the same way that you learn how to read and write because you kind of need to function in society, I think that one of the hypotheses of the dynamic land work is like, okay, let's create a context where you will need to learn to program, and then everybody will learn.
Yeah, it is the thing about programming is it's weird. I mean, I don't program at all, even though I almost have my PhD in computer science. But I can fly through Final Cut right there. You were saying I'm background processing here on editing a video. That was the music. Sorry, I should have muted. That stuff I can do instantly. I can do screenshots and mock-ups and all of that. Really, really no problem. But for some reason, despite my passion for text, when it comes to writing code, because just the very notion that if I make a typo, it won't work, is really, really fascinating. So something just popped into my head is, different people use different terms, but like little pills. Like sometimes if you have tags, they become, what do we call when they're in little things? What's the word for it? Like Tic Tacs. Encapsulate.
Yeah, I think there's pills, tokens. I don't know exactly what you're referring to.
But I could imagine, and this is me being really stupid, but imagine doing programming and all the different variables get visually put like that. It's exactly the same thing. But that means that me, as a complete idiot in this field, feel that these things are complete. Another insight to you guys who know how to do this is when I come to a new city, to take a train or an underground, no problem, because there are tracks. To take the bus, much more intimidating.
Yeah,
right. I can read where the bus goes, but I'm not completely sure because the connections are looser. So what do you think of that idea of somehow, no, I'm not talking about visual programming. It's fair enough. Like you talked about doing find on a page, Brandel. In Author, one of the key functions is Command F. I expect people to know that. I would expect to know that kind of level on programming. But anyway, just a thought. Sorry, that's my mother. I have to tell her I'll call back.
Yeah, I think one of the questions is, I think there is this emotional aura around programming. We saw this at Dynamic Land too, is like people who are non-programmers would often come in and they could do a lot of stuff by putting pieces of paper together. But once it gets to like, you pull out the keyboard, you have the code editor, then there's a click. Then there people are like, oh, this is programming. This is like beyond me. And so I think the question of like, how can we, and that's purely, I'd say maybe not purely, but that's like a lot of that is an emotional thing. Is this people see these trappings of programming. And it can work the other way too. Like sometimes people like don't want to learn Scratch or the block-based stuff because they're like, it's not real programming. It doesn't look like real programming. And so I think the question of how to create these different feelings in people where they feel like they're accomplishing something useful right away, where they feel like they're making progress, and it's not just like you're typing a bunch of stuff in. I think these are like really interesting design questions. Mark?
Yeah, this really rings a bell for me. I mean, I suppose it's awful thing. 18 years now, I think I've been supporting the Tinderbox community, which is interesting. It's a hypertext. Well, it's a tool. It's an annotation tool that actually came out of the early hypertext writing world. But it's interesting because it has a small but quite diverse user base in that it stretches from very technical people to very, very sort of determinately atypical people, broadly doing exactly the same thing. And one of the things, the benighted jobs I gave myself was, trying to document what is effectively an open-ended tool set. And the one thing I've learned is there's no one size fits all. People have really quite, your point about the moment the keyboard comes out, there is that thing, and some people will not accept something unless it is described in a certain way. So you have to have multiple metaphors for the same thing. But I think what Frey was alluding to is an interesting blurring of this, because sometimes, in a sense, if you can just present things you already have, but in a slightly different way, which might seem alien to some people, and it might seem alien to those who are at the moment have most facility with it. I think I do find that really quite interesting, and also things that reduce the degree to which you actually have to effectively learn a language, much as you might learn, Portuguese or Russian or something,
right.
Because to a lot of people it is that abstract. I mean, a programming language may use English words, but even for an English speaker, it can seem very distant, and that's another barrier. So actually, many things, and again, I think that's something I picked up on when you showed your original demo. I'm thinking, right, this is a way, basically, this is a way of bridging a comprehension gap. I know what that thing is. I don't know what it's called, but I know what it is, and I know what it does, and I know it is not that other thing. And so I think there's some really powerful something that can come from using this sort of new type of affordance.
Right. Fabian?
Yeah, it's so I don't claim to have any answer to any of this, but I feel I have the intuition that I mean, you've seen inventing on principle, and I think the feedback loop is probably the most important. That so many steps between what you think you want, you need, how to do it, and the actual result is what kills it. I mean, I learned programming through actually, no, I was going to say at uni, but truth is by hacking my little pocket calculator. And I had a lovely time. Maybe it did what I wanted. I mean, most of the time not, but in the end I managed. But then when I went to learn programming at uni, I had to compile stuff. Like there were so many steps. If I hadn't been like trapped in that room, I wouldn't have made it. So I think a scaffolding of faster and faster feedback loop. And I say scaffolding because in the end, as either leading workshop or helping others to get how beautiful it is helping them, but also that this scaffolding shouldn't be hiding what it is. Like it has to be bringing a deeper understanding.
The notion of faster feedback obviously goes in lots of things in life, and I think you're absolutely right. I think for me, as a completely illiterate person here, if I can write a line or two and then see something happen, that would clearly help to have the faster feedback group. And also, since we're on this fascinating topic, it would be, okay, in author for my own thesis now, one of the things I want to do is get rid of text I've already written. I want to fold it away. So in programming, there's all that stuff you have about importing libraries and setup stuff that I'm sure is very comfortable for you, but looks very scary and arcane to someone like me. It would be really nice if the IDE basically allowed you to enter that, maybe through pop-up list for the basics, and just say, okay, here it is, it's locked away, you have to double click on it to view it again. It's not really scary. You write your actual code here, and they do all the cool things to help.
Yeah, this reminds me of two things. One is something that I complain about sometimes is the files on your computer. It's like now, 95% of them are files from the operating system. It doesn't feel like your file system where it's like all the files are files I put there. And I think what you're getting at is a similar feeling for code, where it's like 90% of my file is like all these import statements that I don't understand. And I would rather, it doesn't feel like it's mine. There's like kind of, it breaks this feeling of ownership and control. And it is a feeling, like it may not be like imperative, but I think it's important. And then the other thing is there's a tweet that I think about a lot. It was someone, I think she was describing being in a programming class, and the professor is talking about like if statements, for loops, and he's saying, I'm in this class and I understand perfectly what an if statement is and what a for loop is, but I don't know where to type it. Like, do I open up Microsoft Word and type it in there? Like, how do I actually use this? And I think that gets at like a really important thing, which is that like a lot of the complexity of programming is like not necessarily the language itself, we're like writing little programs, but it's like everything else, the build system, the libraries, all this orchestration you have to do, the terminal. I think there are a lot of people who can actually write like a little bit of code, like anybody who studied engineering, anybody who does like GIS, anybody who scripts stuff, who plays Roblox. Like, I think there are a lot of people who can write like a little bit of code, but I think programming or engineering involves all these other things that are kind of incidental to the act of writing small amounts of code.
Well, one of the things that obviously goes back to Brett Victor's early work of interactive text on a page. You write an equation, do a slider, and you change the result of it. There has got to be ways to help cheat with that, with basic code as well. Swift, of course, is doing some really great stuff. Even I've done some Swift stuff, but the question of how it goes together with other bits and how you import and how you
right.
Anyway, sorry, Fabian.
Yeah, I think how to have the continuity with a document is something that Brett was doing that I think is really interesting. And I think the Swift, one of the problems with Swift Playground stuff is it's a separate thing you have to go into. It's not kind of continuous with making a real app or with using a real app. Anyway, yeah, Fabian, if you want to.
Actually, Fabian, before you go, just really quickly on that. Sorry. With what you're doing, you should be able to write something anywhere and have it run, right? If it's seen, so you can then have actual code in your library that people like me don't know about. But then you can, if someone writes a sentence saying the time in London is so, like for this meeting today, the time in London is 4 p.m. In New York it is, and then it'll automatically give you that, right? For instance.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's a question of how to specify that, but I think there's this idea of like, I should be able to kind of point at a part anywhere on my computer and kind of write code that runs in that context. And like the system figures out, maybe I have to write, if I'm clicking in a web page, maybe I have to write JavaScript. And if I'm clicking here, maybe I write some other scripting language because this is a normal desktop program. But I think that is actually a fairly powerful like thing that's difficult to do with right now with computing.
Right. Yeah. And Fabian, I hope you will forgive me. Sorry.
You sure that's it? No worries. No, I was thinking that beside the feedback loop, I think what is a big hurdle is vocabulary or just the sheer amount of word you think you will have to memorize, which is actually not true. I mean, you can manage with a couple of words, of course, but it's like when you start a document, any article, whatever, and then you get, at least for me, when I get flooded with an enormous amount of new words that I don't know, or even directly like the list of unknown words, and I'm just, if I'm not extremely dedicated, I give up. So my attempt there is, I'm wondering, and I haven't done this, so again, this is very naive, but if one solution could be to let people decide what the words are, that they can bind from the beginning, say this word does that action, and you might have a little catalog of action, but those actions are going toward the result of what you want. How they're named, you don't actually care. So I'm wondering if that could be an interesting way to see, instead of like step forward or backward, you call it potato, you call it whatever you want.
Right.
And that could be something to explore. I haven't done it. I don't know if it's been done, but let's say freedom toward not being flooded with maybe a scary vocabulary step at the beginning would help.
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing we played around with at Dynamic Mind that I'm still quite interested in was sort of the diagram-based languages, and the way in which you built it was you kind of would draw different symbols and you tell the computer what they mean, and then you could compose the symbols into larger programs. I think that there's a really interesting like emotional element to that too, where it's like, if you defined all the symbols, you're kind of bought into the system, right? Like you're like, these are my symbols. I added all these myself. And I think that is a very powerful effect. Like people really like, using tools that they feel that they've made themselves. And so I wonder if that would also help ease the learning curve / motivation curve. Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting. The tweet you mentioned really echoed with me, because I definitely still have that. Now I've been noodling around with things I probably shouldn't be playing with, because I don't dignify myself as saying I can program, but I can do stuff with scripts and things. And again, going back to the community I mentioned earlier, this is one of the things I find it's interesting, getting to people with the point that they realize that the abstraction they do studying medieval history is no different to the abstraction that somebody does writing a program. You're just abstracting different things. And that's another thing I think would be useful to unlock. So in other words, the way you deconstruct the problem. So when you're looking at a manuscript, well, you need to consider it, you need to know the following things about it. It's just that, you may not think of it in terms of lists or strings versus numbers or whatever, which aren't things that actually aren't of themselves particularly challenging, except they seem abstractly abstract
Right.
to people who are not used to using them. But I just, hearing you mention that sort of tweet earlier, made me think back to this thing. The number of times I see people who were basically sitting there telling me, well, I can't do abstraction. I'm thinking, no, you do it every day. You're a professor of whatever. You can do this. You just don't do it in this similar way. And again, maybe we lack some bridging metaphors there.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of, I guess there's two examples I think of. One is the kind of reading and writing example, where it's like, obviously there was a time when most people couldn't read or write, but it is a problem we have largely been able to solve. But if you'd asked somebody, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, they would have been like, oh, that's ridiculous. Like most people will never be able to rewrite. And then another example is, I think this was originally via Brett. It's like, most people, or a lot of people, probably could not pass like a Chinese class. But obviously, if they had been born in China, they would know Chinese. Like, it's kind of like, it is not a question of like cognitive ability. I think like most people can learn how to program, or almost everyone can learn how to program, given the right context.
Not so sure. The reason I say that is people have, in my experience, a very different kind of. Okay, as an aside, one thing that I've been trying to look into recently, and I'd love to discuss more in the group, is where in the brain you store factual type knowledge is relatively well researched. But where do you store in the brain whether you are a Republican or a Democrat? Using that as a fun example of your way of viewing the world, right? Where is your religion in your brain? It's got to be somewhere. And people of different political persuasions will look at things very differently. I think that also goes to artistic visions and sports, sexual orientation, and so on. For instance, I cannot understand, and I think some of you would agree, why it's exciting for someone to watch a bunch of guys with shorts running after a piece of leather and putting it either here or there. I don't understand that. My brother is gay. I can understand being gay. It's a sex thing. Fine, I get it. But following football, no, I don't get it. So the reason I'm saying that now is when it comes to programming, like the visual stuff I do with the camera, to me, it's second nature. And people say, I have a good eye, that expression. I don't know what that means, but I've taken probably over 1 million pictures in my life. There is something in my personality that is about that. When it comes to the understanding of, I write a sentence that ends with a semicolon and has a curly bracket, not another bracket, it's not a spare bracket, and it has to have a period here, but it can't be there, and it has to refer to text that is further up. That is a very specific kind of thinking. I know that Tim Cook and Apple and all of this is pushing everybody must code, but I think not necessarily, you know, and I also think that the difference between an engineer and an architect and a builder are different mindsets. You know, if you have someone designing a house and they are also an engineer, they may think too much about the load balancing and all of that stuff, where what they should be focused on is the human experience. You know, obviously in software, that's the interface design. I focus on the interface design. My programmers focus on the programming. And I think it's a really good dialogue. Some people are smart enough to do both, no question. You know, there are outliers of genius in all kinds of fields, but the whole assertion that anybody can program, okay, I guess everybody can program in a small way and badly, but to do it well enough to be useful, that's something else. Anyway, the high horse.
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that there's differences in terms of inclination and natural ability. I mean, the same is true of reading and writing, right? Like, I want to push back against the strong claim, like people, you know, there's like a large percentage of people for which it's impossible to find the right context.
Yeah, oh, sorry. Okay, Fabienne, you are next. Oh, sorry, just one more thing.
Fabienne?
Couldn't help it.
I think you're muted. I think you're muted.
He's not muted, he's just being funny, I think. Are you being a French Parisian mime, or are you?
You hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
You mute me on purpose. I'm joking. Anyway, what I'm saying is, I don't think Freud, you paid attention during the presentation, because Omar precisely showed that the syntax and the little punctuation and all this doesn't matter. It looks like this, and it's maybe a way to prevent one from exploring, but there are so many kind, not just of languages, but of ways to program, that the syntax that is repulsive, that sometimes might be interesting, but there is like so many other ways, and it's you might not have yet found a way that fits your way to do it, but it doesn't mean first that it doesn't exist, or it's not even out there yet, or maybe it's already out there, but you didn't spot it yet, or maybe you need to make it yourself. I don't know, but they're just like the syntax and the comma and all that. Nobody likes it. It's not interesting. It's just to make it easier on the computer side. But there are alternatives, as has been shown.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for highlighting that. I mean, it even goes back to http://www. Not all those needed to be there, you know, as Ken Berners-Lee said later. So I'm sure a lot can be hidden, and there are lots of different languages, but it's still an issue. We're winding down. Peter, please.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that everyone has the ability to learn to code if they choose to learn it, and they're using a language that is designed to meet them halfway. There's certainly lots of notations that have been optimized to make it easier for people who already know programming languages to pick up their next programming language. And there are all sorts of conventions, and there's history going back to the 1970s on how we choose to express computational ideas in text. And all of that background, unless you're coming from the correct background, will be inaccessible to you. And that makes it very, very hard for an end user programmer to take a look at code. It really does look like a foreign language, but not all code has to look that way. There are languages like the Inform language for interactive fiction. They're designed to look and work like natural language. You have languages like Perl, which borrow ideas from human linguistics, even though they have the masks in a notation that's going to look alien to you. But the linguistic categories are built into the programming language, and those kinds of ideas are accessible to an end user using the right tool. I also think that even if you're not programming on a day-to-day basis, understanding the programming language concepts can be of tremendous aid in other professions, particularly law. I really think it would be absolutely invaluable if we require all law students to take at least one programming course that is focused on the conceptual level, as opposed to here's the notation for a particular programming language level, which is what most intro CS courses tend to wind up doing. That would help us to get better law, and it would help us to get better regulation of code and software. When lawyers start trying to regulate technology, they have this horrible tendency to come at it with no clue as to what's going on, and therefore they accept dogma that is common in law schools. For instance, when I went to law school, I got into tremendous arguments. Yes, good for lawyers indeed. Got into tremendous arguments with some of my colleagues because the law school's position was no one would have ever written one line of code anywhere but for the possibility of their getting a software patent. Utterly absurd. I know oodles of programmers. I have yet to meet a programmer who thinks software patents are a good idea, but that was the dogma at Syracuse Law at the time. Yeah. And anyone trying to question that was running their head against a wall. However, I found that more recent law students that I've met who have had some background in code all think that software patents are a horrible idea. So once you've had that experience, you suddenly realize that the process of code is like working in language and writing, and you're drawing on all of the literature that came before, and it's a leveraging process, and any moderately complex program is going to be invoking tropes that have roots dating back decades in history and leveraging upon the work of dozens and dozens of other people. And that doesn't match the mode of patent law where you were imagining that one corporation had its own lab doing its own thing in secret, and you needed to barter the temporary monopoly on using the technology to acquire a disclosure. The disclosure comes naturally. It's the natural mode that programmers work. Yeah. And once law students understand that, it completely changes their entire perspective on intellectual property.
Yeah.
Okay, so, getting off of my horse.
So the intellectual property is one thing, but the reason I highlighted this, the book again here, when Peter, you have to read it, is that language in itself puts things in boxes, right? Programming does that even more. And in many cases, that is really important and really, really useful. But there are other examples. I mean, look at Mark, who is a super intelligent academic and gifted human being. But look at his language, right? He is so flowery and poetic with his language. A computer would have a hard time to parse half of what he says. And I think that is a really, really important adjunct to being able to code. And that is to be able to expand and extract and communicate as humans in ways that isn't direct. So to learning in code is going in one direction, to go the opposite direction, I think is also very, very useful. And yeah, sorry, yes.
Well, I wanted to give one last thought, and then we should probably wrap up. I mean, I think a lot of the discourse around, well, there's kind of a job discourse. I think there's also there's a sort of computational thinking discourse. And I think that's part of what people are talking about here is like, how do we decompose, how do we abstract things? But to me, I feel like the exciting thing about programming is more about agency. It's like, you know, programming lets you put things on the screen. It lets you make things move. It lets you automate things that are on your computer. And like a lot of important things are on your computer, right? Your taxes, your hotel booking, talking to your friends, the documents you're writing, your photos, all these things are just, they're inside the computer. And so in order to get at them in some sense, you have to do computational work. And so that's kind of the framework through which I think about, you know, what is the value of programming, or what is the value of having that kind of agency over the computer?
Yeah, and one thing that I was going to say earlier is that when you ask Siri or whatever assistant something, you are programming it.
Yeah. This actually, let me paste this. This is a friend of mine. She wrote this piece about how, you know, in some sense, everybody who interacts with a computer is always programming it. Like, like programming is an artificial thing. Like everything on a computer is programming in some sense. Cool. Yeah, well, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you all for having me and watching the demo. And hopefully I have like a big write-up that I'm working on, and, you know, I have to finish making it a binary that people can download and stuff, you know, that last 10%. But this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, wonderful. Very grateful to have you here. We have these meetings every Monday and Friday. Very variable who shows up, which is good, you know, open office hours. The transcript of this will go into our journal. We're running a bit delayed for reasons, and the video will be up quite soon. So thank you. It's really, really wonderful, and let's keep the dialogue going.
Yeah,
thank you very much,
for
and
sure.
have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thanks. See you
Bye.
all.
Bye-bye.